fit into that category. Time management games are very popular right now. Creating, building games like Sims, sandbox games, organizing, ordering, a lot of stacking games. Now you recognize a lot of these you probably already picking out are very much in the casual arena. And so these are kind of the atomic level pieces. A lot of casual games have recognized that, hey, people like this certain feeling. And I'm going to write a whole game that's just based around that. And really a lot of the early games started on these concepts and then grew beyond them and tried to add in so much trappings that people are taking right nowadays, are taking some major steps back and saying, you know what, we realize that fun games aren't about all the rest of the trappings. It's about these core concepts, and that's why there's a resurgence in casual games. I mean, when you think about it, games started Tetris, one of the ultimate casual games. That game is, what, 25 years old now? I mean, the thing is ancient. And yet, we're still playing those kind of games today. We went all these big steps up from our adventure games, and everybody tried to expand it out, and now people are realizing, you know what? The fun parts of games are really, really very small. And so you see a lot of this things coming back out. Additionally, when you start looking at things like this, start dealing with the mental archetypes, you find that if you can combine two of them, you get an even better game. That's one of the things about Tetris. Tetris isn't just about the ordering and stacking, which is fun. It's about, organizing, getting things compacted in. One of the things, at least for me, that's always fun in Tetris, here's being honest about what you enjoy about games, is that feeling when you get 4 of them in a row and it goes kaboom, and they all drop down. That's that. I mean, that's really what's coming out. You can drop these things down and start talking about, why do I feel good when that happens? And if we can understand why we feel good, then as we're building our game, we can make sure that stays in there. And see if we can exemplify it. We can make it bigger and better. I should have put this one first. Physical experience archetypes. I'm not going to talk too much about these, but it's interesting that this has also become something that people have started recognizing and moving into as an atomic kind of version of a game. So instead of trying to put all of this stuff in here in games that have all sorts of reflexes and mental things and storyline and art and are just too big, games are getting more and more, funny enough, brought down to more just, I'm going to succeed at this one thing. And so we've seen in the classic days, I put whack-a-mole down because I think that's one of those, the classic, it's all about reflexes, there's no cerebral involved really, you see it, you hit it. And that's how you play whack-a-mole. But it is a game still, because it's represented as something that we have a physical challenge to play against. Street Fighter would be maybe a little bit more complex version of that. Precision, coordination, any FPS. The guys that are really good at FPS, I don't know if you guys have played against some of the really good people, but there's a certain amount of thinking that you have to do in an FPS to kind of strategize. But the guys that are really good because they can do headshots on an instant. It's not because they've outthought you and figured out where they're going to go. Part of it's knowing the map, well, a good part of it's knowing the map, but the rest of it's all about that coordination of being able to just jump in the air, throw a grenade, pop over this, shoot that thing, and hit, anybody. Right. Rhythm games, though, this is something I think is really fascinating, that we're seeing this, which is pretty much a physical archetype. It's simply something that's dealing with my body now has, I'm catering to something that my body inherently likes to do, follow a rhythm, move in a standardized pattern. And I've turned it into an actual game, which is incredibly successful. This whole archetype now of rhythm games, you've got Rock Band, Guitar Hero, and now, of course, Guitar Phrase as well. But it all deals with this idea of just following timing. But the reason it works is because our bodies like that. Our bodies like this sense of something still going. Sorry, I was asleep. All right. And emotional experiences. This is kind of the new territory for games. This is where I think there's some really, really interesting things that are going on. And there's been a couple attempts this direction. It's really tough to get over this. And I think it's partly because people in general don't understand how to manage emotions in games, or even what happens. This is one of the places where people think of shaking up the box, drop stuff out, and maybe it works and maybe it doesn't. But emotions are an incredibly powerful and incredibly, I think, predictable thing if we understand how to use them. And this is good news for us, because as Christians, we understand that emotions aren't simply just random things that happen, and so for some reason over millions of years we've evolved with the sense that when our friend dies we feel sad. It's not what's going on. We understand that there's a purpose to every one of these things. So when we feel something, when we feel an emotion, when we consider something that has occurred around us, that reason we have that emotion isn't random. God's put that emotion there to teach us something. There's something to be learned. And I don't just mean from our daily experiences, I mean emotions in general. When you go through Scripture, every single emotion that a human can experience is laid out there someplace else. I've done a bunch of study on this, and it's just fascinating. Emotions are all over in Scripture. And in fact, everything that God has done, if you look through it, is not based on logic. It's based on emotion. God is telling a story that's meant to tug at our heart, not our mind. And so both what God's doing through us and what our games can do is can appeal to that sense of emotion to produce a story that's actually worth playing and people worth understanding. I mean, if you're going to share the gospel story, you can't really share it as a logical experience. It doesn't really work that way. Some people have had, some experiences where they can kind of, you can argue out certain points. But when someone gets converted, they get converted because of a change in the heart, not a change in the mind. And here, because we can understand these things, because we have Scripture to go back to, because we have some place to go dig into, we actually have an opportunity to understand and utilize these emotions far more than anybody else does. And this is someplace where we have the upper hand. So it's really important to look at. So what's interesting is when you look at movies and pretty much any media that deals with emotional conveyance, stories, other things like that, books, when I say stories, but I guess stories cover everything. You look at, you realize, we're all familiar with, there's certain archetypes that you see over and over, this little kind of sub-story, kind of story themes that occur over and over. The loser wins, the lousy guy, the underdog gets, these things come up, and you, especially if you watch kids' movies, which, having kids, I watch some kids' movies. You discover that kids' movies pretty much, fall into 2 or 3 categories, and that's it. It's got the exact same story over and over. Why do you see that exact same story over and over? Because it works. And what's really strange about it is when you look at those stories, they're all parts of the gospel story. They all fit right in. Now, some people might say, well, that's because the gospel story is based on those. No. God put those things in us to actually match up. So, when we start talking about feel-good archetypes, we start using very small fonts so that you can't read it back there. I just wanted to put down a list of these, and I think these are things that we need to look at in terms of what we're putting into our game and figure out how can we get these kind of stories into the game and then get the emotional response out of it. And I shouldn't say we should actively. This is obviously when you look at a lot of games, you see these things in games. But you see them in the story context, you don't necessarily see them in the gameplay context in many cases. And a few places where games have actually managed to get these archetypes into the from the story into the gameplay context, you find them incredibly successful. I don't know if you guys have played Call of Duty 4, not World at War. So Call of Duty 4 is one of the games that just people are raving about, and one of the reasons is it has an incredible amount of emotional context put into the game that is done things that no other game has, put people in experiences that no other game has. There's some pretty amazing things in there. And especially in the case of an action game, I think some other games have tried to put that into other experiences, like in some Final Fantasy games. But anyway, so I'm not going to read through all these. I think if you guys have scanned them already, you'll recognize a lot of them. You could probably each attribute 5 movies to each of these guys easily, and probably a couple games that would work out along this as well. One thing that I do want to talk about on here is in terms of game design. Some of these are obviously done very often. Unrighteous judge, we want that. The weak few conquer against the strong many. Almost every game has that. But some of these you can actually recognize gameplay things. Diverse abilities come together to accomplish more than they could apart. MMOGs. That's what you're doing with a lot of these things. You've got these concepts of a tank and a glass cannon that you bring together to actually be able to accomplish something that a whole party of tanks couldn't do. Some of the other things are less seen in games, and I think are really interesting areas that we can try and explore. I keep wanting to see somebody make a game where it looks like it has all the standard mechanics. Let's take an RTS, and it has all the standard RTS mechanics and the standard probabilities and statistics, but then we throw them out the window quietly in the background while nobody's looking, and actually make the gameplay experience based on what we pick up from the player being interested in doing. So, for instance, you could actually make a little tiny group win against a large army simply because you realized that the player was focused on that group and was interested in it, or had put an investment, or where do people put emotional investment and actually form the game around people's emotional investment instead of just simple statistics.